Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez in for Chuck Todd in Washington on a historic day and a fraught moment in this country. For the first time in American history, a former president has been indicted on federal charges. And not just any former president. He's also a declared candidate for president and the current frontrunner for the Republican nomination. A short time ago, the Justice Department unsealed a 37-count indictment against Donald Trump. A 49-page document filled with evidence, photographs, text messages, transcripts of audio recordings, witness accounts, and more. Taken together, it paints a damaging portrait of reckless and criminal behavior in handling some of the nation's most vital secrets. The 49-page indictment includes 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information, 1 count of false statements and representations, 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct, 1 count of withholding a document or record, 1 count of corruptly concealing a document or record, 1 count of concealing a document in a federal investigation, and 1 count of scheming to conceal. Minutes ago, Special Counsel Jack Smith spoke publicly for the first time since his appointment more than 6 months ago, as his office unsealed the charges against Mr. Trump.
The men and women of the United States intelligence community and our armed forces dedicate their lives to protecting our nation and its people. Our laws that protect national defense information are critical to the safety and security of the United States, and they must be enforced. Violations of those laws put our country at risk. Adherence to the rule of law is a bedrock principle of the Department of Justice, and our nation's commitment to the rule of law sets an example for the world. We have one set of laws in this country, and they apply to everyone.
Also implicated in today's indictment is Mr. Trump's personal aide and body man, Walt Nauta, who, according to the special counsel's office, helped Mr. Trump move boxes and conceal items from authorities. As you might expect, the former president has lashed out at the Justice Department and the special counsel's investigation. In one post minutes ago, he referred to the special counsel as a deranged psycho. And he posted this video last night after disclosing he had been summoned to the courthouse early next week to face these charges.
They can't stop because it's election interference at the highest level. There's never been anything like what's happened. I'm an innocent man. I'm an innocent person.
Now, beyond the legal implications of this indictment are, of course, the political implications. So far, we've seen Republicans from the Capitol to the campaign trail rally around the former president, and his allies in the House of Representatives are considering ways to potentially try to intervene in the special counsel's case. Meanwhile, President Biden has remained relatively quiet about the case. Here was his response earlier today when asked by reporters about the charges facing his potential 2024 rival.
Mr. President, are you concerned about the decision in light of the Trump indictment? If everybody can please call me.
President Biden, have you spoken to Attorney General Merrick Garland yet?
I've not spoken to him at all. I'm not going to speak to him. No comment on what happened.
We have a lot to unpack this hour, but let's first begin with the latest on this sweeping 37-count indictment against Mr. Trump. Joining me now from Miami is NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian, along with former federal prosecutor and legal affairs correspondent for Politico magazine, Renato Mariotti. And in a moment, I'll be joined by criminal defense attorney and NBC legal analyst Danny Savalos. Ken, let's start with you. Walk us through these 37 counts. What is the former president facing in this indictment?
Gabe, he's facing a devastating portrait of willful misuse of classified information and an alleged conspiracy to obstruct justice. I've covered the intelligence community for more than a decade. I've covered a lot of classified document cases. I've never seen an indictment as detailed and as powerful as this one. You know, we should mention that obviously Donald Trump is innocent until proven guilty, but the details in this document are amazing. First of all, the impact and the moment of the documents itself that he had. And in paragraph 3 of the indictment, it says that the documents that Trump had included information regarding defense and weapons capabilities of both the United States and foreign countries, United States nuclear programs, potential vulnerabilities of the U.S. and its allies to military attack, and plans for possible retaliation in response to a foreign attack. And it goes on to say that the unauthorized disclosure of these documents puts at risk U.S. national security, intelligence sources, and methods. And then the indictment says, and on at least 2 occasions, Donald Trump did disseminate classified material to people who didn't have clearance to see it. And in one case, there's a recording of it. And there's a transcript of that recording laid out in this indictment. There's also a transcript of a recording that we know was made by one of Donald Trump's lawyers. So there's so many remarkable pieces of evidence in this that you don't normally see in a case like this. And just for context, Gabe, last week, an Air Force colonel was sentenced to 3 years in prison in a case where he was convicted of taking about 300 classified documents home over a course of years. No allegation that he shared the documents with anyone. No allegation that he obstructed justice. He got 3 years. This case is much more serious, and the obstruction of justice conspiracy is like a whole separate part of the case that alleges that Donald Trump conspired with his body man, Walt Nauta, to conceal and try to enlist his lawyers in a scheme to conceal the fact that he had these documents even after the Justice Department came after him with a subpoena. And what you see as you read through this indictment is none of this had to happen. If Donald Trump had simply given these documents back the first time the government asked, this case would not have happened and we would not be here, Gabe.
Yeah, and Ken, this seems to be what's called a speaking indictment, of course. And really, as you look through it, it really tells a story here. Talk to me, Ken, about how this feels different than the other indictment a short time ago, a couple of months ago now, with the hush money case. How does this feel different than the state indictment up in New York?
Yeah, not to take anything away from that indictment, there's an argument to be made. It's an important enforcement of the rule of law in New York. But that indictment is very technical. It has to do with tax and business expenses. It was brought by an elected Democratic prosecutor, and almost immediately, even the most moderate anti-Trump Republicans dismissed that indictment as a political attack. Whether you believe that or not, that was their reaction. This is going to be much harder to do with this federal indictment, although people obviously are doing it, because this was an indictment brought by a career federal prosecutor who was not under the day-to-day supervision of Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States. The only role of Merrick Garland here was that he could have blocked any action by Special Counsel Jack Smith if, according to the regs, that action was so outside the normal practices of the Justice Department that it shouldn't go forward. That didn't happen, obviously. Jack Smith made these decisions on his own. That's why you saw Jack Smith today, not Merrick Garland, giving that news conference or that statement at his separate offices away from the Justice Department. So that's why this feels different. And also, it's a federal case, right? And so what you're going to have when Donald Trump surrenders on Tuesday is this remarkable picture of the former president, the man who was in charge of the federal government, now being fingerprinted and his mugshot taken and his passport taken away by the very government that he used to lead, Gabe.
And Ken, Renato, before I get to you, Ken, I just want to ask you very quickly. Walt Nauta, the body man, he's also been indicted. Can you dig into what role prosecutors allege that he played?
Well, what they say is that he helped Donald Trump conceal the fact that he had many more classified documents than he was willing to let on, and move boxes of those documents when the government was trying to find them. So before, for example, the Justice Department came down to visit, this indictment alleges that Walt Nauta took more than 60 boxes of documents outside of that famous storage room in Mar-a-Lago. And Gabe, we know from our own reporting that the Justice Department gave Walt Nauta and his lawyers a chance to come clean and to cooperate, and he just refused to do it. And his lawyers are being paid by a Donald Trump political organization. So right now he's facing some very serious charges. Now, whether he stays on Team Trump and maintains solidarity with Donald Trump in the face of this serious criminal case remains to be seen. But that's what they say. They allege a conspiracy between Donald Trump and his butler and body man to obstruct justice.
And Renato, what's your reaction to this indictment? You know, is this the best possible case the DOJ could have brought?
No question. I think it's fair to say that this indictment is more problematic for Trump, more serious than all of his other legal problems put together. This is an absolutely devastating indictment, very difficult to overcome. And I think a big part of his strategy here would have to be to create so much delay that he is in poor health or has ended his life before it actually gets to trial. Because I think that it'll be very challenging to explain away the obstructive statements with his attorney in particular. I think very challenging to explain why he's saying that, they should lie to the Justice Department and say they have no documents, to suggest that he praised an attorney who had destroyed documents allegedly. So just some comments that are very challenging to explain. And Ken mentioned, of course, that recording where he's talking about a document that he said he could have declassified, but he didn't, and it's secret, but he's nonetheless sharing it. Very challenging. And I will say also the breadth of documents at issue here, over 30, I think it's 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information, including nuclear secrets, for example. I think it's going to be very challenging for Trump and his team to explain to the jury why those are not important secrets to keep. So I just think on its face, this is not only a very devastating case, but it's a very straightforward type of case to prove and a very difficult case to explain away. And that's a very big host of problems all in one for the former president.
And Renato, in your role as a former federal prosecutor, you kind of touched on this just now, but do you think those recordings are the most crucial piece of evidence here?
I think so. I think they're extraordinarily important. I think, it depends on the way you look at it. The most important piece of evidence is the classified information found in his residence, right? In other words, that was what started all this. That's the proof in the pudding. You're seeing it on the screen right now. I think in many ways, this case is very different than the other legal problems that we've seen Trump have. A lot of the Trump matters have been white collar cases where there's a focus on his state of mind. Did he have the intent to defraud? Did he have the intent to obstruct? And the thing about the willful retention of classified material, it's sort of like a drug case. If you have meth in your garage or in your house or in your office, that's a crime. And everyone knows that meth is not lawful to possess, or heroin is not lawful to possess. Those documents, it's apparent that after he's president, he is not lawfully possessing those documents, particularly, and I agree with Ken on this point, particularly when the Justice Department is trying desperately to get that stuff back. And to use the words of Bill Barr, the former Attorney General, you're jerking them around. And of course, as we see from this indictment, there's lies that are being fed in a alleged conspiracy to obstruct justice. I just think that's very challenging to explain away. And that at the core, putting the obstructive conduct to the side, the fact that he wanted those documents very badly, that he shared them, that he was desperate to keep them, I think that's very, very challenging to explain.
And I want to bring in Danny Ceballos now. Danny, put on your defense attorney hat here. How do you even go about defending this? Can you?
This is the rare case where we have gotten a preview of how the defense might approach this case. We've gotten it in a letter defense attorneys wrote to Congress, and we've gotten it through interviews that defense counsel and now former defense counsel have given on network news shows. And it may go something like this. Whether it's effective or not remains to be seen. But you may see a narrative where the defense develops a theme that early and often Trump, when he was approached by these agencies, he may not have turned over documents immediately, but he wanted to see what documents he could take and not take. And that initially, when the National Archives wanted these documents, that Trump's team was willing to work with them. And they will probably develop the theme, if they're able to make this into admissible evidence, a form of whataboutism. In other words, that the National Archives, with other presidents, set up an infrastructure to help them with the president to ex-president transition and the moving of documents. His defense team might argue that Trump didn't have the benefit of that, and if there was a haphazard removal of documents, it was inadvertent. They will probably argue that when the government set a deadline for the subpoena, they were inflexible. They didn't allow rolling production. They set an arbitrary date. But really, whether or not any of that's even admissible, let alone probative of a defense, is not really even a sure thing. But at least in terms of the general narrative they may try to put out there, it's probably going to center around inadvertence. And then the government will have the burden to prove this was much more than an accident. This was much more than an oops. This was something that was deliberate. And so far, they've made a lot of those facts out as alleged in the indictment.
And Danny, I'm looking through this indictment right now. You can see on page 19, it says, a message between Trump employees. And one of these employees sends a text saying, quote, he's tracking the boxes. And Danny, I want to talk about, early on, might a defense have been, look, he's a former president. He has a lot on his mind. He may have not actually known the details of where these boxes were. He wasn't paying close attention to it. He could perhaps say that this was something his employees did. But according to this, page 19 of the indictment, it appears that the former president knew exactly where they were and was asking them to be moved. How does former President Trump's team defend against specifically that?
I think you've hit on the major theme. Why are we here with this defendant? And it goes back to your two words, early on. I suspect this could have been averted if early on, and I think the Maginot line here is the time when agencies other than DOJ were involved, when the National Archives was saying, we would like our documents back. I fully believe that had Donald Trump negotiated and gotten those documents back before other agencies felt it necessary to make a referral to DOJ, we never would have been here. In fact, that's an argument that the defense is making. They're making the argument that this started out as National Archives using a federal statute that doesn't have any punitive measures, but they just wanted the documents back. Maybe the defense doesn't realize they're inadvertently making the prosecution's argument, which is only by escalating to this to the point that the National Archives and the other agency felt that they needed to refer this to DOJ, that was a line that was crossed. That was the point of no return. That was the event horizon. After that point, once DOJ was involved, you arguably already have intent of all of these, and I call them overlapping elements. I think concealment shares a lot in common with hiding documents or retaining documents or some of the other overlapping Venn diagram elements that are contained in this indictment.
And Ken, I want to go back to you. And as I'm going through this indictment as well, something that really jumped out at me that I thought was very interesting is there were several instances spread throughout the indictment where the special counsel's office decided to put in quotes from things that Donald Trump had said back in 2016 when it came to the handling of classified information. Of course, back then he was talking about Hillary Clinton. But why do you think that the special counsel's office found it necessary to put those specific quotes throughout this document? Was it a type of storytelling device, or was it perhaps to show that the former president should have known better?
I think both, Gabe. I mean, this is, as one of our guests said, the ultimate speaking indictment. And the Justice Department knew that they're not just speaking to an audience here of jurors or of the media, they're speaking to the whole country, half of whom is predisposed to doubt this case. And so they needed to put as much information in there as possible. You know, the average person doesn't really deal with classified documents and doesn't maybe understand why they're so sensitive and, what the implications are of taking them outside of a sensitive facility. And so the Justice Department thought, well, maybe we'll inject some of what Donald Trump himself has said about this to help sort of fill out the picture. And they did a lot of different devices in this indictment to sort of try to explain why this matters. And then you heard Jack Smith. That was the theme of his remarks, really, is, the men and women of the intelligence community risked their lives to protect this information. That's why it's so important. And if I could just dovetail on something you said, Gabe, not only did Trump know where the boxes were, all throughout this thing, many Trump defenders said, well, it's not like the president packed his own boxes when he left the White House. Actually, this indictment alleges he did in some cases. He was actually, according to this indictment, involved in packing his own boxes. So he was personally involved in taking some of this material from the White House to Mar-a-Lago, Gabe.
Incredible, some of the details that we learned just a few hours ago when this indictment was unsealed. Renato, I want to bring you back in, and I want to mention that this indictment includes the exchange captured on the recording at Bedminster. According to the transcript, former President Trump says, as president, I could have declassified them. Now I can't, but this is still a secret. How key is that piece of evidence?
Oh, it may very well be the most important piece of evidence in the whole indictment. I mean, there's different ways of looking at it. One thing I will say is, we often talk on shows like this about the downside of a person who's under criminal investigation speaking out. And here is part of the downside. Donald Trump, when he realized that the FBI had raided his residence, could have kept his mouth shut. But instead, he went on every program possible. He went on podcasts. He went on recordings. And he talked about what his defense was. He was telling Sean Hannity that his defense was that he declassified these things with his mind. And of course, he locked himself into what a defense might be here, and the prosecutors wisely have developed evidence that totally undercut that defense. And by the way, actually prove some of the charges that they've set out elsewhere. For example, he says that he knows that this information is secret, but he's sharing it with you anyway. As we noted a moment ago, that's transmittal of information. It shows his knowledge that it's a secret. So I just think the fact of the matter is this is just incredibly challenging. I mean, I thought Danny did a very nice job of setting out a potential defense. And often on the defense side, you're trying to just throw mud against the wall, trying to see what sticks. But it's just very challenging to run together a thread that resembles an actual credible defense that would actually get you out from under these charges. I will just say that it's very challenging. And I know this from experience on the defense side. I've been on the defense side for many years as well. Very challenging to get the jury to select not guilty, vote not guilty, and check that box 30-something times, 37 times. Even if one time they select guilty, that's the end for Donald Trump.
And Ken, before we go, I want to bring up something. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida says the DNI has not provided Congress with an assessment of potential risk to national security from these documents. Why not?
Well, one theory is they don't want to create a discoverable document that then gets injected into the trial. Because if they do a damage assessment, you can make an argument that Donald Trump and his attorneys will have a right to have it, and that could be a problem. But they are required by ODNI policy to eventually do a damage assessment, Gabe.
Ken, Danny, Renato, thank you all for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. And let me turn now to Rahema Ellis, who's outside Mr. Trump's New Jersey home in Bedminster, New Jersey. And Rahema, it's good to see you. Is Trump's reaction to this indictment, a redo of the Manhattan indictment?
It seems to be that way. The former president has been busy today playing golf with a Republican congressman from Florida, Carlos Jimenez, but he also was busy on his social media site. Shortly after Jack Smith made his statement about the indictment, the former president took to his social media and said something to the effect of Biden moved his boxes all over the place, including Chinatown and up to his lawyers in Boston. Why isn't deranged Jack Smith looking at that? He goes on and in another post, he says something to the effect of, this is crazy, just like Jack Smith. In addition, he says also on his social media site that they all spied on my campaign. Nothing is beyond them. So, yes, he is reacting. It's very much like the kind of thing he did after the charges were revealed on him in Manhattan. And we'll see if this continues. This is pretty much the way the former president reacts. This is not unusual. I don't think anybody is surprised by this. The question becomes one of, will it continue?
Yeah, and Rahema, we just saw just a few hours ago, with the former president on social media, as you said, attacking the special counsel in such personal terms. But talk to me a little bit as well about the video that he posted last night. What were some of the arguments he was making there? He called himself an innocent man. But do we have any indication of how his team and, likely his campaign plans to deal with this in the coming days? Do we expect these attacks against the special counsel to escalate, Rahema?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised unless someone suggests to him and convincingly can suggest to him that his team refrain from doing this kind of thing. Even last night, it appears very clear that the Trump team was prepared for this. He had said so himself on social media that he was expecting himself to be indicted, and he wasn't being casual about that expectation, because shortly after the word was revealed last night that he was being indicted, less than an hour after learning that news, the Trump campaign sent out a fundraising email. This is very much what we saw happen in the Manhattan case. And they raised some $12 million after putting out fundraising emails and videos in that regard. So that was very profitable for them, and they may be hoping that they can do the same kind of thing here, because the legal defense charges, in terms of the cost of these charges, is only growing, Gabe. It's not shrinking. It's growing. So, again, unless someone will say to the president he can be convinced that he should change his ways, it seems like his team is poised poised to try and control the narrative in terms of the public relations events their way, which is going after the people who are filing charges against them and attacking them in some very clear language.
Rahima Ellis in New Jersey. Rahima, the Trump team fundraising just minutes after this indictment was announced. We'll see how this plays out. Rahima, thank you. And up next, Trump world chaos, reaction from the Republican presidential field, and how far the former president's allies in Congress will go to defend him. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. As we noted, ahead of the unsealing of the special counsel's sweeping indictment against former President Trump, a number of Mr. Trump's Republican primary rivals had rushed to his defense. His chief rival, Ron DeSantis, along with Tim Scott and Nikki Haley, have all echoed Trump's attacks on the Department of Justice, decrying politicization and weaponization. We haven't heard from them since the charges were released. Another Republican primary candidate, Vivek Ramaswamy, went as far as saying he would pardon Trump if he is elected president. And at the same time, Asa Hutchinson called on Trump to drop out of the race. And then there's former Vice President Mike Pence, who's taken a more nuanced view. Take a listen to what he said to reporters just before the charging document was released.
I think it's deeply troubling to see an indictment against a former president of the United States. I had hoped that the Department of Justice would see its way clear to resolve this matter without an indictment. That being said, let me be clear on a few points. No one is above the law. And in America, we have to stand on the rule of law, irrespective of politics. Secondly, the handling of classified materials is a very serious matter.
Given the indictment, should Trump suspend his campaign at this point?
No, look, I think any consideration of that would be premature. Look, everyone is innocent until proven guilty in America. I think the former president has a right to make his defense.
And we have a supersized panel to help navigate this historic moment. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale, AP White House reporter Darlene Superville, senior advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders, Faz Shakir, and Republican strategist Doug Heye. Thank you so much for joining Meet the Press Now. And Darlene, I want to start with you. Big picture, what is your reaction to this historic indictment? What stuck out to you?
What stuck out to me is what's always stuck out to me, which is the question of why. Like, why did Donald Trump take these documents? He didn't have to be in this position, right? He could have returned the documents when the government and the National Archives asked him to return them, but he resisted, and this is what many in Washington would call a self-inflicted wound, and he did not have to be here.
And that's what we were talking about earlier, right? What would have happened if they had just given them back? Or, not fought the returning of these documents. So that is a huge question here. And Ali, I want to turn to you. Republican allies of Donald Trump, they have walked a fine line here, but almost all of them yesterday came out and backed him, including, Governor DeSantis. Even Nikki Haley had an interesting, comment today. But I want to get to you. Have we seen any indication in the last few hours that there has been any shift in the Republican narrative here, or at least how many people are backing the former president?
No, it feels like all the people who would usually back him are backing him. The people who would usually be the first to point out his wrongdoing are doing so. Senator Mitt Romney said something akin to what you said, which is that Donald Trump brought this on himself. He didn't have to be in this position. And then, of course, their allies, even though they're technically his rivals, the people who want the same job that Trump is trying to get, are all trying to also stack themselves behind them. I actually think the one who did the most artful response was probably Pence, who left himself the ability to pivot in either direction, saying it's weaponization and politicization, but also saying that no one is above the law. That allows him, I think, the best position to pivot from going forward, even as he's not saying Trump should drop out like Asa Hutchinson is. Right.
And, he said he wanted to hear the facts come out. Right. So is Chris Christie. Well, now that the facts are out, it should be interesting to say if that message shifts in the next couple hours or the coming days. Doug, I want to turn to you. The last time that former President Trump was indicted, by the way, can we just say...
that's
not a normal sentence.
Yeah, exactly. The last time he was indicted, we saw his poll numbers go up. Do you think that happens here?
I don't think we know yet. And, when you say the next few hours and days are going to be indicative of this, you're exactly right. And it's because it's 6 o'clock tonight. Ron DeSantis is speaking to the North Carolina Republican Convention. Tomorrow at noon, Mike Pence is speaking, and then Donald Trump, 6 o'clock tomorrow, will be speaking. So all eyes are going to be in Greensboro, North Carolina. And if you've now seen what the details are in this indictment, it gives you political permission to make the separation. In politics, when you have an opportunity, you're supposed to take it. Yeah. They didn't take it with the first indictment, and there were good reasons for that. A lot of people, even Democrats, thought this is political or not the indictment that you wanted. Again, a weird statement. Yeah. This is very different. It's very serious. It's federal. And if you're Pence and if you're DeSantis and you want to create separation from Donald Trump, you've got your opportunity right now, and you have the venue to do it.
But they may also have the opportunity to alienate some of his supporters, which is, of course, what can be difficult here. And by the way, this isn't the last investigation; it was also the Georgia investigation.
Well, and we know that the Republican nomination doesn't go around Donald Trump. It goes through Donald Trump. You can't hope that somebody else is going to do your job for you. The politics here should be rather static. You have an opportunity, take it. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. They haven't done so yet. Again, tonight and tomorrow, they have the opportunity and the venue.
Maybe on the third indictment.
Maybe. Well, Faz, I want to turn to you. President Biden and the White House has not touched this so far. Do they have any choice? How do Democrats play this moving forward?
Well, you got to honor the legal case, which is to take it out of a political realm and say that the facts are pretty damn strong, as you see in the characterization. You almost have a caricature of a comic villain of Donald Trump who's showing off his trophy case or his baseball signed by Babe Ruth. The things that we don't know that don't come through yet, and the reason why the White House has to hold, and I think a lot of the Republicans are going to hold, is who else was he talking to about this material? Because all we learned through the indictment is we've talked to a couple of individuals writing a book or journalists or whatever. Isn't it possible that a lot of people traveled through Mar-a-Lago? Who else is he talking to about classified materials involving military strikes and what Iran might do, what Iran might not do? And I think that ends up coloring so much of the political case. Right, and that's different from the legal case. And I think Doug was making this point that politically you have to hold a bit to allow some of this color. And presumably a lot of that might be on tape or on audio and other forms that we don't even know.
But I would add, too, that the White House is holding partly also because they don't want to be seen as playing any role or having any, input in what is happening to the former president.
But that said, the challenge for President Biden, obviously as the leader of a government, is that you have to honor that the DOJ is going to conduct a thorough investigation. I stand with the FBI, who does an honorable job serving. Yes, I'm not going to meddle in this case. However, you do have a role of defending that, which you could see Mike Pence's answer was suggesting that if you put me in charge as president, I too would respect law enforcement. Whereas the others, right, they're all staking claims where, like, yeah, if you put me in charge, I will screw law enforcement. I might fire all these guys, which is a radical position to take.
Allie, I want to get to you because you, of course, were with former President Trump back in 2016. Yeah. That's when we met. I was following.
It is when we met.
And you saw him speak about Hillary Clinton back then, over and over again. Let's actually play some of that.
In my administration, I'm going to enforce all laws concerning the protection of classified information. No one will be above the law. Hillary is likely to be under investigation for many years, probably concluding in a criminal trial. If she were to win this election, it would create an unprecedented constitutional crisis. In that situation, we could very well have a sitting president under felony indictment and ultimately a criminal trial. Her current scandals and controversies will continue throughout her presidency, and we will make it, honestly, look, it's going to be virtually impossible for her to govern.
It is surreal to hear those words. Now, what do you make of that, Allie? Listening to that 7 years later, and here we are.
I mean, if we were to rewrite Alanis Morissette's Ironic, you'd need to put a line in about that because he's saying the exact thing that ends up playing out now for him. It's partly why you see Hillary Clinton posting a but her emails picture on Instagram because you almost have to just call out the hypocrisy of that. I do think it's stunning, though, that this is exactly how it happened. He made so much hay of the emails, and then there was a misuse of email within his administration. You saw him now say that I would take care of classified documents. Now he's taking them back to Mar-a-Lago. I mean, like, you couldn't write it better than this way. And that's why I'm actually surprised that more of his opponents aren't jumping on this, because it's such a clear example of, if you want to be the law and order party, this is law and order, is defending national security. And I think to make this case to the public, and as we watch this case move through, how do prosecutors prove this to a jury? How do they say it's Iran? This is detrimental to national. That's going to be a huge part of selling this to the public too.
And Darlene, how do you see this playing out? Because we at this point are expecting the other trial potentially in March of next year, the hush money trial. We don't know yet the timeline for this one, but chances are it will, potentially line up just as this presidential election is ramping up. How do you see this playing with the Republican Party and potentially backing a candidate who is facing a federal criminal trial?
It's a little time will tell kind of a situation. Trump has a lot of support with the base. I think that we need some time to see whether a lot of those people will stick with him or take the information that's in this indictment and say, enough is enough, I've had enough, I don't want this person, someone who would be this callous with classified information, to be president.
Doug, I want to switch over to something that you said. You said that this could be potentially the opportunity. Look, I've been with Governor DeSantis on the trail the last couple of weeks. I just don't see him. He's been very careful, of course, in his stump speeches, not to mention Trump. He only talks about it when he's directly asked. Is there any way that you can see him potentially pivoting to attacking Donald Trump's drama here? But he's gone so far to attack the weaponization of the DOJ. He's kind of boxed himself into a corner now, hasn't he?
Well, I think you can do both at the same time. DeSantis sort of made that remark of, I don't know anything about paying hush money to strippers and things like that. Right. You can highlight the drama, and you can say, regardless of whether or not Donald Trump did something wrong or not, there's too much drama around him, too much chaos. He can't focus 100% on beating Joe Biden. And by God, we need a Republican who's going to focus on beating Biden. That's a message that can sell, and it ties directly into Ron DeSantis's I'm a winner message, and we lose too much with Donald Trump, especially when you consider the independent voters, the people who voted for Donald Trump voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and Joe Biden in 2020, that flipped Arizona for him, made North Carolina so close. Those are voters who are not going back to Donald Trump. And all of this ties into the DeSantis, I'm a winner argument.
Right. And Allie, I think Nikki Haley is trying to make that argument too, or trying to have it both ways, attacking the drama, but saying the weaponization. Do you think that's going to fly with her?
And not mentioning him by name at all. I don't think that you can be too cute by half. I actually think that's a great argument to make. Tackling this through the lens of electability is a really good argument for people, because Republicans just want to win back the White House. But no one is actually making that explicit argument. And I do think for voters, A, you can't have them infer that that's your argument. Someone needs to say it. But B, the reality is that this legal process is going to drag on for months. And we could have voters who voted in Iowa, New Hampshire, even South Carolina and Nevada before this has even hit court. He could end up stitching up the nomination and then potentially getting indicted. And I think for voters, asking them to entertain that as a possibility, every candidate should do that, because that is a central focus here that they're not going to just infer. You got to put it right in front of them.
And Boz, I want to kind of wrap up with you. You were with a candidate back in 2016, obviously Bernie Sanders, that had a lot to deal with in terms of classified documents and the whole Hillary Clinton emails thing. He famously said, "We don't care about your emails." How is this different? Because the argument that many Republicans will make is like, well, Hillary Clinton wasn't prosecuted. This is, voters don't care about this stuff. How is this different?
I mean, it's certainly a gift for President Biden and his reelect campaign. I mean, the fear of Trump certainly was a mobilizing factor for many Democrats, plus 50% of the country. For Biden, who has his own weaknesses right now with animation and excitement and passion, he's going to get it out of the Trump case. And I think for many people, I get the electability arguments. For many people are just going to say, can you imagine putting that guy back in charge as president for 4 more years with that kind of deranged conduct, that kind of deranged mentality, a person scorned by the FBI, you put him back back in charge, what's he going to do to the government? What's he going to do to everybody around him? Who would want to work for him? Those kinds of common sense thoughts, I think, are going to mobilize a 50% majority in this country to say, oh, no, we're not going down that road again.
Well, a supersized panel on a historic day. Allie, Darlene, Boz, Doug, thank you all so much for joining Meet the Press Now. We really appreciate it. Some of you are actually sticking around. And as we mentioned, we've not heard much from Donald Trump's competitors for the Republican presidential nomination since the full details of his indictment were released by the Justice Department this afternoon. But here's some of what we heard from his chief rival, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, last night. Quote, the weaponization of federal law enforcement represents a mortal threat to a free society. The DeSantis administration will bring accountability to the DOJ, excise political bias, and end weaponization once and for all. Joining me now is Ken Cuccinelli. He's the founder of the Never Back Down Super PAC that is supporting Governor DeSantis. He was also, of course, a top official at the Department of Homeland Security during the Trump administration. Ken, thanks so much for joining Meet the Press Now. So, Ken, Governor DeSantis put out that statement before the charges released. So after seeing the evidence today, Ken, should he change his tune?
So I don't think so. I think that he is on the right track. It's one he's been on for some time. He's stayed at a more general level. Surely this indictment is nothing like the one in New York. Nonetheless, in the context of Hillary, Obama, Biden having their own document issues, the average American isn't going to see it much deeper than that and sees the bias that takes place not just in this case for bringing it. And mind you, I was a state attorney general. There's a difference between whether you've got someone dead to rights and if what reads out in the indictment is accurate. You know, there's a strong technical case here against the president. That's a different question from whether the case ought to be brought, just like it was in Hillary's situation, and as is ongoing with Joe Biden himself. This will put a lot of pressure on the Department of Justice to actually bring the Biden case. But DeSantis is still on the same path he has been on, and that is the de-weaponization of the justice system. And I think that's something that Americans look forward to. And I see him being very consistent on that, and we're happy to echo that here at Never Back Down.
But, Ken, you seem, in your answer, you seem to suggest that this is different from the previous hush money case. Do you think this is a stronger case?
Yes, simply because the New York case, the district attorney there essentially made up a new legal theory to charge Trump with. That is not the case here. These are longstanding statutes, and there was a lot more detail in this indictment for your viewers than the average indictment includes.
If this case is stronger, as you just said, why bring up that it shouldn't have been brought in the first place?
Well, because you still have a situation, this is brought not in by itself. There's everything else going on in our society. And when you have a Department of Justice that continues to show demonstrated bias, they cannot expect to bring a case like this.
So you're bringing up a political argument, Ken.
You asked me a question. I'm answering it. And the American people to see it as being made on an objective basis. And that's what Governor DeSantis is going after hard and fast. And he's made some very firm statements about things he'll do about that, and I appreciate that.
And we do appreciate you coming on here, Ken, and answering questions. But the point I was trying to make, if you think that this is a stronger case, and you bring up the politicization of the Justice Department, but if the facts are there, no one should be above the law, right?
Well, certainly that's the rule of law is a fundamental American precept, and it's been one that's been bent and abused rather badly over the last 10 years by the FBI and this Department of Justice. They're not in a position to simply expect people to view their actions without being as coming through a political lens, and this just continues that path. I do not think the president's supporters will respond to this in the same way they did the New York indictment. I was listening to your conversation about the drama. That is wearing on people. It is going to be a different response. But I do expect you're going to see the same response from Governor DeSantis, and that is a commitment at the general level to get into the Department of Justice and to depoliticize it. That's something that every American should want.
And Ken, you mentioned the drama. So do you agree with that argument? Do you agree that Donald Trump just has too much drama and should not be the Republican nominee? Because that seems to be the argument that you're making. The candidate that you're backing, though, has not made that argument so explicitly yet.
Well, the way you ask it is sort of binary. I would say that it is an important factor for an awful lot of folks. And I've traveled to a lot of states already, talked to a lot of grassroots folks and grassroots leaders who don't appreciate the drama. This is not a plus for the president. And when you compare it to Governor DeSantis's much more effective governing style in Florida, that is a stark contrast. And it weighs very heavily in the governor's favor with ordinary voters. You've heard of Trump derangement syndrome. There's also Trump exhaustion syndrome, and that's among many of us who have or had supported him.
And Ken, I want to read something from the indictment. The government alleges that the classified documents Mr. Trump stored in his boxes included information regarding defense and weapons capabilities of both the U.S. and foreign countries, United States nuclear programs. The unauthorized disclosure of these classified documents could put at risk the national security of the United States. Bottom line, should he have had those in his possession after he left the White House?
Certainly not. He shouldn't have had, and no president should have any classified documents even after they leave the White House. Bottom line, I think you see a focus here on the national security documents as opposed to all classified documents. That's the only limitation I really see the Department of Justice having imposed on itself in bringing this indictment.
So why can't Governor DeSantis and other Republican candidates say what you just said?
Well, perhaps they will. Honestly, I've read most, but not all of the 49 pages so far. We're all still digesting this in greater detail. I think that that's going to take a little while for that dust to settle. People are going to want to see what happens on Tuesday in Miami. I don't think there'll be new information, but one never knows. I mean, some of this information came out before today from unofficial sources, and it's an interesting question to know. How did CNN get the recording of the president on audio? And those are other questions that, you know, really leave people with concerns of the politicization of this that undermines what on paper might otherwise be a strong case.
And Ken, I know you're with the super PAC backing Governor DeSantis and not with the actual campaign, but do you think that Governor DeSantis would pardon former President Trump?
Oh, I have no idea. That's one of those questions that only he can answer. And, you know, that's a long way off. Right. But as your earlier panel talked about, it is a long way off, but there's going to be trials between here and there on a number of these issues, and that kind of drama does not weigh well with ordinary Republican voters. It is not a plus for the president, and having a leader who's already proven, like Governor DeSantis, who doesn't bring all of that baggage, is very attractive to people all across America.
And Ken, I want to ask you something about something that former Vice President Pence said earlier today, that other Republican candidates have said as well, including Governor DeSantis. They've really made a point of saying that they would clean house at the DOJ. Do you agree with that, given that you just said that this indictment is stronger than the previous one? So I understand you have questions about whether it should have been brought at all, but why say that you should clean house at the DOJ if the DOJ did its job here?
Well, let's set this case aside entirely and still point out there are reasons to clean house at DOJ and the FBI because of the 10 years of politicized behavior that I talked about that is now extremely well documented, including lying in courts and lying to the American people by DOJ, by the FBI. There's an awful lot of cleaning out that has to happen. Unfortunately, you would have expected the director, say, of the FBI to do part of that. That's a Trump appointee that he has complained about and that Governor DeSantis has said he would remove on day one. He has failed to depoliticize the FBI, and Governor DeSantis is committing to put others in who will.
Ken Cuccinelli, founder of Never Back Down, the super PAC backing Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Ken, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
So even in the face of today's historic indictment, President Biden is staying the course and staying out of former President Trump's legal troubles. President Biden today visited with service members and their families in Fort Liberty, North Carolina, a state he narrowly lost to Mr. Trump in 2020. When asked to respond to the Trump grand jury indictment, he said he had no comment. The White House declined to comment on the news earlier today and yesterday pointed reporters to the Department of Justice, emphasizing that the DOJ conducts criminal investigations independently from the administration. So I want to bring in NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli, who joins me now live from Fort Liberty, North Carolina. And Mike, how is the White House responding to this latest news, the details of the indictment, and how successful has the president been at staying out of...
Well, Gabe, the point is that they're not responding. This has been really the posture of the White House really since day one of the administration, and it's both a political imperative and a legal necessity. On the politics, I remember very well covering candidate Joe Biden, who repeatedly promised to the voters in the 2020 campaign that he would not treat the Justice Department as his personal defense attorney, which was his view of how Bill Barr was acting in the Trump Justice Department. And he also continued to, he understands full well how Republicans are treating this moment, trying to accuse his administration of politicizing itself, of attacking a political opponent, weaponizing the Justice Department. So that part is really the politics here. The legality is so critical, though, to this administration because the president is himself the subject of a special counsel investigation. The White House has argued that the Pence special probe into his handling of classified documents was much closer to what happened in the Biden case, the improper but, well-intentioned bad packing, perhaps, of documents versus the very clear, as the Justice Department is laying out in this case, laying out of Trump's handling of it. So it's a very different case. But that's why it was so interesting what Peter Alexander was able to get the president to say yesterday at that news conference to talk about this moment when the impartiality of the Justice Department is being questioned, at least by Republicans, and may be an attempt to undermine the public confidence on this. The president saying he's never once done this, that he believes it is completely independent. And as he also put it, in his case, I'm honest. The former president's not. Even that brief comment is an overstepping of the line in the view of some in the White House, and that's why he's been kept at a distance as much as they can today. Just wrapped up this event here.
And Mike, I want to get your take on something that allies of former President Trump have been trying to argue throughout the day and really over the last several days. This idea that President Biden or that Attorney General Merrick Garland somehow authorized this indictment. How does the president and the White House plan to counter that narrative that it was somehow Biden's Department of Justice that authorized this indictment against the former president?
Well, they're just simply reiterating that this is something that was handled by the Attorney General at a very early stage, and that handling of it was to defer to a special counsel. Listen, Gabe, there's been some concern, some frustration even with the Attorney General inside this administration that he's been too much of a Boy Scout, perhaps. This is a former judge. Remember, he was the chief judge on the second highest court of the land, the D.C. Circuit, and he's acted perhaps too much like a judge to some in the White House. But that being said, that Boy Scout behavior is something that is serving the administration well in this moment because they feel, for instance, that it was unequal treatment of Attorney General Garland not to appoint a special counsel for the Pence case versus what he did in the case of President Biden. But there's only so much that this White House can ultimately do, and they're not going to engage in a tit-for-tat with these Republicans. They're just going to continue to hear from the White House over and over again, no comments, and to say what they said earlier today, which is they only learned of all these developments over the course of the last 24 hours from public news reports.
And Mike Memoli traveling with President Biden in North Carolina. Mike, thank you. And for some final thoughts, back with me now is our panel, NBC's Ali Vitale, Faz Shakir, and Doug Heye. Just so much to unpack here. Ali, I want to start with you. Final thoughts as we end this historic day. Where does this go from here, and what do we think is going to go down in Miami next week?
Oh, my God. I can't even think about Miami next week. I want to get through the weekend first. But I love the way that you went at Ken Cuccinelli on this idea that DOJ is both right to be exploring this and also extremely political and too political, and everyone needs to be reformed there. I think that that's a contentious point that I hope more Republicans are pressed on, especially now that the indictment itself is out there and unsealed. The fact that he's on tape, theoretically, according to this indictment, it makes it so much harder for Republicans to argue.
Yeah, the facts, when they came out this afternoon, up until then it was theoretical, hypothetical, anonymous sources they could say. They didn't believe it. Now it's on paper. And Doug, how do Republicans thread that needle? On the one hand, they need to, argue that this is politicized somehow, but this indictment lays out a very difficult set of facts, as you just heard Ken Cuccinelli say.
Yeah, and I think probably to Ali's chagrin, I think the smartest Republicans haven't said anything yet.
Much.
It's very easy to get out there. I know. I've been watching. It's very easy to get out there and be, all pro Donald Trump all the time. But the ones who are waiting to see what the details are. So they're looking at this indictment. It's why we haven't heard from Mitch McConnell. I think is probably the most important Republican to hear from. We haven't heard from John Thune yet.
Right.
My guess is they're going to be a bit more critical than we've heard from some of the House Republicans.
We've heard a lot of House Republicans, but Senate Republicans, not so much. They're waiting to see.
You can see where this is going to go, though, with Cuccinelli's interview, which he just did, which is that they want to do the hypocrisy hit. They want to hit Biden as if they were somehow the same behavior. One is they're trying to absolve. They don't want to discuss his behavior. So you're going to see that. Can you even acknowledge some of the facts in the case? Can you talk about them? That he could have absolved himself of this case. He could have resolved it at any point. He chose not to. He hit it intentionally, purposefully. He tried to deceive his lawyers and tell his lawyers to do illegal acts. So I think the behavior of Trump, as more details spill out, are going to compel more Republicans to talk about it. But I think if I look at their strategy, they're trying to play this hypocrisy game as if Biden's behavior is the same as Trump, and that's a loser, I think.
Right, and a question I'll ask you about, Miami next week, the spectacle that we could potentially see, on Tuesday. What do we think is going to happen? There's already Vivek Ramaswamy already said he's going to go down there. Do you expect this to be a rallying cry for Republicans, much like they tried to do in Lower Manhattan? Didn't quite happen, but it was, I was there, briefly, and Marjorie Taylor Greene went there, and granted, there wasn't a huge crowd, but does this change in Miami-Dade County?
I don't think we know yet, but obviously it's a concern. And if you go back to New York, you had Kevin McCarthy and other Republicans saying, don't protest. And why do they not want Republicans to protest in defense of Donald Trump? Because of the protest, which led to much other things, just a few blocks from here on January 6th.
Ali, I'll give you the last word. Reading this indictment, what went through your head, and just how stunning was this?
I mean, just the fact that he asked at one point to his attorneys, isn't it better if we say we don't have the documents?
Right.
Yes, it would be better if you didn't have the documents, but you can't lie to the feds. And certainly that's one of the ways that we saw the special counsel here able to pierce attorney-client privilege, because you can't use your lawyers to try to do crimes. This is a conversation we had when we were covering the January 6th insurrection and the committee hearings. This is a common thread that we see Donald Trump and the way that he tries to use the people around him. And I think that, again, that entire document, the 40-plus pages that we all spent speed reading through today, has so many different bullets in it that are damning alone, but taken in conjunction are huge.
Ali, thank you so much. And Doug and Foz, thank you so much for being here on this historic day, a very busy news day here in Washington. Thank you all for helping us unpack it. We're back Monday with more Meet the Press Now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.